I think we'll get started. Thank you everybody for coming to this, our third CPS panel event of this party conference on the topic of whether the Conservatives have an agenda for welfare. I'm James Hayward. I'm the Head of Welfare and Opportunity at the Centre for Policy Studies. I will start off by introducing our panel. I'm delighted to say that we have the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Therese Coffey, with us today. It's particularly nice of her to give us her time, considering that the Liverpool match is on right now. And to Therese's right, we have James Kirkup. James is the Director of the Social Market Foundation think tank. And on my left, Gavin Rice, the Head of the Work and Welfare Unit at the Centre for Social Justice think tank. And I should say before we start, firstly, please put your phones on silent if they're not already. And we will have questions at the end. There is also the online platform that you can submit questions on, and we will endeavour to get to your question if you put it on the online system. We have been doing our best. So I think I'll just start off by sort of setting some context for the discussion. We've had, obviously, a tough year for many millions of people as a result of the coronavirus pandemic. I think most people in the welfare sphere would probably say that, on the whole, the government can be quite pleased with how the system coped. I think there was probably a lot of scepticism as to how the government systems were going to cope with there suddenly being many millions more people submitting claims, and actually the system coped relatively well, and it was a reasonably positive story, obviously helped by the fact that the government put a lot more money into the system. Obviously, the flip side of that is that now we're coming out of the pandemic, the government is trying to withdraw the support that's been in place, and there has been a lot of controversy politically over some of those measures and whether they should stay or not. Obviously, specifically the £20 uplift to universal credit. I think at the same time, the pandemic is a sort of moment that kind of, if you like, sort of ends a decade of welfare reform on the Conservative side that has sort of mainly run its course. A lot was done when the Conservatives came in 2010, and it sort of feels now that the pandemic's over, or will we hope be over soon, and we sort of get into the recovery phase, that this may be the moment that the Conservatives need to set out their renewed agenda for, as it were, what is the next decade of welfare reform. And so with that, I will pass over to Therese Coffey.
Well, thank you very much, James, and it's a great pleasure, and thank you for inviting me along today and dedicating one of your sessions to this, and indeed to everybody who's come along. And I think in terms of the agenda of the Conservative Party, well, IDS is the architect of what is still very much the philosophy behind the redesign of our benefit system. One, trying to make it simpler, but in particular, the underlying philosophy is you'll be better off working than not working unless you cannot work. And while I'm really proud of the technocratic approach, if you like, of the system did hold, it did feel at one night when typically we get about 50,000 people a week claiming for universal credit. We had 100,000 in a day, just over. So was it going to blow? And it held on. And that was a great relief, not just for the department, candidly, but for the people who turned to us, many of whom for the very first time ever. And I think we can see that one of the things about the design of universal credit in terms of its principles is that it actually kicked in straight away for people who were on it already, and can always turn into discussion about what level do people still need support from the system, but that meant that when their hours fell, actually their support through universal credit automatically rose. So it was designed that way. I think the other grander design, and we're still getting over this in terms of the world of work, is that it no longer has the cliff edges, which is the inherent element of the tax credit system, where there were cliff edges if people were working more than a certain number of hours, and probably 16 hours is the most common one, And even now, large employers design their jobs around the basis of the cliff edges so that they have 16-hour contracts because people don't want to do 20-hour contracts. And so there's an element there as we gradually do move everybody off the old benefits and tax credits that we'll absolutely have a system that instead of the tax credits propping up wages, that the grander reforms that we're doing, increasing the national living wage, aspects of the work allowance, which is a feature of the universal credit, but all those things where you will, the more you work, the more you earn, the more you retain, until we actually do and want to, and I'm very keen to try and make sure that instead of people being seen to be in work poverty, to actually be in work, progressing in work, and have in work progression as one of our strong themes coming through in the next few years. So in terms of trying to make sure that I think one of the elements about contributory welfare is quite often people, with a lot of understandability, say, I paid in, what am I going to get out of this? And I think that we will always have an element that while we do means test most of our welfare in terms of, unlike tax credits, where if you do have a certain amount of savings, we're not going to give you the support through universal credit that you might have expected. But anybody who pays national insurance will get the job seekers allowance if they need that help, or indeed that's the route to statutory sick pay. So I think it's important that we will continue to recognise that means testing will be an approach that we take. But I think one of the biggest things that I'm wanting to try and make sure we focus on in the next few years is for people who right now think they cannot work. And we published the National Disability Strategy early this year, a cross-government approach, and all sorts of ways of trying to improve people's life. But one of the key things which we still have a target on and want to focus on is about where we flip our system about welfare benefits in terms of people with health conditions, is instead of our system basically trying to encourage people to show how they really cannot do any work at all, to actually flipping that and see what it is that what is it that you can do and we can support you to do, and through some of our programs of access to work and similar. So I think it is about genuinely a positive, an escalator, trying to help people. It is there as a welfare net rather than a welfare trap, and that will continue, I believe, to be the agenda. And I think one of the other important things that's coming out of this pandemic is that we do desperately need to try and improve the resilience of people. So one of the things is we've doubled the number of work coaches around the country. You know, we have more job centres than there are police stations in this country. People do turn to us for help, and it's our job to help people not only to get back into work, but increasingly, although we've got still double the number of people looking for work who are on benefits than we had pre-pandemic, we also want to shift the focus in due course to getting people, as I say, to get on in work as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Therese. Gavin?
Well, thank you very much, and I pay tribute to the Secretary of State. It's really good to be here. I absolutely agree that the last 10 years have kind of framed and shaped the reform of the welfare system that we've seen from 2010 onwards, and the chairman of our own organisation, Sir Ian Duncan-Smith, was obviously instrumental in that, not only through his work through our think tank, but also in his time as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions as well. But on the theme of the next 10 years, and indeed longer and beyond that, I want to look a little bit beyond COVID and the period of the pandemic. There's lots of discussions to be had about the specifics of the £20 uplift, about the end of the furlough scheme, about the fact that the universal credit caseload has roughly doubled since January 2020, and look actually beyond the pandemic context. And what are the long-term pressures facing social security and the welfare state, and the size and scope of the welfare state, and indeed its cost in this country? Well, back in 1947, during the Clement Attlee government, spending on social security in today's prices was approximately £11 billion, a supposedly socialist government. Whereas today, if you include pensions, spending on social security is upwards of £200 billion. Now, just to give you sort of some kind of context, just over half of that is spent on those who are not of working age, so that's mostly the state pension, and just under half goes on those that are of working age. It went up quite a lot, particularly during New Labour and during the Blair years. The Cameron government, with George Osborne as Chancellor, tried to get that spending as a proportion of national income down, but we're still in a situation in which, obviously, obviously COVID has messed with the figures a little bit, but about 12% of GDP or thereabouts is spent on social security in some form. That's up from 4% in the 1940s. So before the pandemic, back in 2018, the Office of Budget Responsibility, they said that on current trends alone, current spending patterns on welfare, on education, on healthcare, and so on, you would need to see, in order to stabilize the debt that would be produced, taxes to rise by 1/3. Well, as we all know, there are limits to the amount that you can tax a country, and some economists are suggesting that the UK may already be at its taxable limit already. So that's quite an alarming prospect, looking in the sort of the medium to long term. And yet, at the same time, the UK does not actually have a generous welfare system on a per capita basis by the average standards of the OECD. So what is going on? Well, the biggest driver really is something that we can't control, which is demographic change. So the rising non-working population due to the increase of the population that is retired. And I think it is absolutely important that we are committed to those who are retired and who've paid in all of their lives. And I think David Cameron was also right when he was trying to make savings in the welfare system to say, well, actually, pensioners cannot do very much in their own lives in order to change their income. So therefore, you know, it would be unfair to set about cutting their incomes. Not that we should be increasing them by 8% in line with earnings, of course. So therefore, we need to look at some of the other key drivers of pressures on the welfare system in-work benefits. One of those is clearly the issue of low pay. So we had record employment levels before the pandemic, and yet we still had a very, very large amount spent on welfare. Well, this is probably because there was very little wage growth since 2008, particularly in lower paid sectors of work. Another is obviously housing. So we funnel billions per year into the pockets of private landlords. And so if we fix the housing crisis, then that might help relieve pressure on the welfare system and the need for housing benefits, or the housing element of universal credit. But another one, which it's less easy to talk about, is the effect of family breakdown and unstable families. According to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, using their relative poverty measures, a couple with one working full-time and one working part-time is 11% likely to be in poverty. That's calculated with 2/3 of the median household income. Whereas a single parent of all categories is 46% likely to be in poverty. And if you just think about that, you know, median household income is about, in the region of 30,000. If you imagine a situation in which you've got someone earning 20 odd, and then you've got a part-time primary care parent. They separate. That goes from being a financially self-sustaining household to a non-financially self-sustaining household. And usually what you see is that the parent that is left with primary care responsibilities is less able to work. They may not be able to work at all. They maybe have to work limited hours. And therefore that creates huge pressures on universal credit. So I think there's lots of root causes that we need to look at in terms of the long term beyond the pandemic, though it's absolutely right that we focus on the increase in caseload due to COVID in the short term. But in the question of do the Conservatives have a plan for welfare, I think these are the kinds of long-term demographic headwinds that we need to get really serious about and really think carefully about affordability and the proportion of national income that is spent. I'm just going to leave you with a quote as well, in case some people are thinking, oh, this is sounding a little bit socially conservative, and I would appreciate that argument. The increased demand for social security from the state is no doubt largely the result of the disappearance of those smaller communities of interest and of the feeling of isolation of the individual, who can no longer count on the personal interest and assistance of other members of his local group. This was not Edmund Burke talking about little platoons. It was not Benjamin Disraeli. It wasn't even Boris Johnson. It was none other than Friedrich Hayek, that darling of the libertarian right. And I think that is a good note on which to stop and to consider how we might rethink the relationship between individual, family, and state over the decades to come.
Thanks very much, Gavin. I think there'll be plenty for us to get our teeth into there in the discussion. Finally, James, your initial thoughts.
Thank you. I should start with the essay question we've been set, which is, do the Conservatives have a vision for welfare? And I should say that I'm the outlier on the panel in that I'm not a Conservative. I'm here from a dreadful centrist think tank, so my advice is available to Conservatives and Labour alike. But But having proclaimed my independence, I'm going to then undercut myself by saying I very much agree with an awful lot of the things that the Secretary of State just said, particularly about in-work poverty and pay progression. I mean, in terms of what I would suggest as a friendly outsider, the Conservative agenda for welfare should be, I would strongly encourage more attention and more thinking around in-work poverty and pay progression. Because it seems to me that if you are a party that values hard work and endeavour and effort, then you should be deeply concerned about the fact that it is possible and commonplace in this country for people to work hard, and still find themselves in a condition of poverty. Now, I'm sure we may well get into a discussion later on about the ways we measure poverty, but I'm going to chuck in one additional stat to the ones we heard from Gavin. He said 11% of dual income couples are in poverty. I had 12% in my notes, so we may be adding the numbers up differently. The number I was going to produce was 31%, which is the percentage of households with a single earner that are in poverty after housing costs. So essentially, households where people are doing the right thing, they are going out and they are working, still find themselves in a condition of poverty. Now, that I think is something that should get more attention from politicians of all sorts and should be addressed more in policy. Quick thoughts on how to do that. They're not all things for the state to do, I should say, but I'll start with the things that the state can do more of here. I think Therese is absolutely right to talk about Job Centre Plus. There is one more stat. A few years ago, I think the department did a randomised control test with people in work, a group of whom every fortnight saw a work coach to work with them on how to get themselves better training, how to lift themselves up the wage ladder, how to advance themselves in work, how to earn more at work. The pretty scientifically robust results of that randomised control test are that those people, over the course of a year, saw their earnings rise by £260 more than the control group who did not get that intervention. So when the state, in the form of Job Centre Plus, works with people who are in receipt of welfare while at work, it can give them more of the wherewithal. Sometimes it's literally just the confidence, the wherewithal to advance themselves in work, to raise themselves up the work ladder. So that's one relatively simple intervention that can be done. It does require even more Job Centre Plus, pluses. It requires more work coaches. Essentially, it requires Therese to do even better in the next spending round and get more wherewithal from the Treasury to deploy this stuff. That's relatively easy. There is a harder challenge around the original purpose of universal credit, which is the right one, to eliminate those cliff edges, to allow people to retain more of their income as they work and work more. The cliff edges, they're not all gone. They're small hillock edges. They still exist in some places. Therese is right to mention the 16-hour reluctance. Lots of employers, if you talk to them, will say that they have people who work for them who do not want to work more than 16 hours still because of their understanding of how the system works. There's a slightly more significant design feature of universal credit, which I think is worthy of attention, which is the work allowance. Now, when you hit a certain point, when you're working and receiving welfare, obviously you start to see some of your welfare be withdrawn. It's withdrawn at a rate of 63%. That is still very steep. Making it more generous is very expensive. There's no bones about that. But if you're going to make more progress in work poverty, if you want people to have more of an incentive to work more and advance themselves more while in work, then that needs to be made more generous. I think there's a question about the way the work allowance functions since it applies to a whole household. And there's a particular design feature here, or a design flaw, depending on how you look at it. So if you are a dual earner couple, all of your earnings together count towards the work allowance. Now, what that means is that if you are the statistically most likely household combination, a man and a woman with children, where the man goes out to work either full or part-time, and the woman starts to work part-time or wants to work more, then her earnings suffer a significant reduction with every hour worked, a 63% reduction. And there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that's a real disincentive, especially when you add in the other non-welfare factors like the cost of childcare. So there are a lot of households where, at the moment, the inadvertent design of universal credit is creating still a very big disincentive for those households to earn more and lift themselves out of that condition of poverty. The final thought I will give you is this is not just something for the state, for Therese to solve. There is a real role, much more of a role for employers here. There is a question about employers and how much more they can and should be doing to help their workers rise up that wage ladder. Should they be providing more coaching, more training, more encouragement for people to climb and advance and progress in work? I think they should. Should they get more of a reward and encouragement from the state? Yes, I think they should. That could involve the better use of the state's purchasing power through procurement. It frankly can and should involve the use of moral suasion. The government should be essentially handing out goodies and sweets and badges to those companies that do the right thing here. Therese, you have a great deal of power from the bully pulpit here to encourage good behaviour from employers, and I strongly encourage you and the rest of your party to do that over the next decade that we're talking about.
Thank you, that was great. We're going to get into, obviously, a lot of these issues now in the discussion. I thought as a sort of an in for the starting that discussion, I might mention, so the CPS wrote recently a major new report on the welfare system, and as part of that we did lots of public opinion research, polling with YouGov and focus groups with Public First, and the report is here. There are copies of it at the back if anybody would be interested in picking one up. But one of the sort of headline polling results that we got from our YouGov polling was that around 7 in 10 of those expressing a view in the poll said that they thought that our current welfare system was unfair. So I thought I would start by asking the panellists whether they think our current welfare system is unfair, and possibly more importantly, whether what they think the reasons are for such a large number of people saying that they think it's not. And perhaps we could start with the Secretary of State.
Thanks for that, James. I'm not sure when the polling was done by Public First, but Rachel Wolfe, for a time, was non-exec director of DWP. She kindly came and joined us to help stimulate some of our thinking on and policy creation, not necessarily as an advisor, just about how we went about devising some of our thoughts. And I think it's fair to say, as I tried to allude to in my opening remarks, about there's no doubt the agenda has shifted entirely to means tested, apart from some of our disability benefits, things like the personal independence payment. But I'm conscious that, as I say, it's that feeling that you've paid in, so what do I get out of it when times are harder? There's no easy way to try and say there's a differential rates depending on whether you've paid national insurance or not, or quite how much tax you've paid in the past. But as I pointed out earlier, nobody should be left without anything who's contributed, even if they don't access the universal credit system. There are other benefits they can access as well. So in terms of more broadly, I think people want to make sure that the welfare element in terms of being fair or unfair, as they perceive it, is also to make sure it doesn't become a trap. And that's a constant theme which comes through from people. They don't want people to be better off not working than they would be working. And I think that's been part of the agenda. And I hear entirely what James says about things like aspects of work allowances and taper rates. It varies. It's almost like a tax allowance of benefits, I think is the best way of putting it. It only applies to people with children or people who we consider to have limited capability to work. But nevertheless, they've been an important step or bridge for people to try and make sure that they certainly will be better off working, recognising some of the extra responsibilities or limitations they may currently have in order perhaps to work full-time than otherwise. So overall, I think I'm not going to pretend that there's a magic wand. As you pointed out earlier, one of our, and as Gavin alluded to, we do use a lot of taxpayers' money on benefits, and I think thinking of housing, certainly I think we're up to £30 billion in the last year on housing support, and the OBR estimates by the end of the decade it'll be £50 billion. So we are doing some in-house thinking, working with what they call nowadays, Deluxe, to look at how we can go about tackling that. But probably the biggest growth is certainly one of the things which I anticipate we may see even more of is in our health benefits. And the personal independence payment has certainly grown in a way that was not anticipated when it was introduced. And to give you an example, 3 out of 4 young people who claim PIP have their primary reason as being mental ill health, and that in itself is 189,000 young people who currently receive benefit focused on that. There may be other benefits they receive as well. So that's one of the things where I'm very conscious. One of the things I'm trying to do as Secretary of State is that very much the issues we face is downstream, and one of the things we need to do is to get more upstream. And I hope that might give us the headroom then to put across, James, coming back to your original question, how is it that people can think that the benefits or the benefit system is fair? And I think by being able to target that even more so to people who really need that support may improve that prospect of public perception.
James, Gavin, do you?
Well,
Why do you think so many people, according to our polling anyway, seem to think that the current system is unfair?
well, can I suppose, declare an interest. Before I came to this job, I was a journalist for 20 years. I still am sometimes, writing for The Spectator and others. And my simple answer is I blame the media, which sounds a little trite, but I do think there is a question about the way the media narrative around benefits claimants has been set up for many years. I think a lot of media outlets, including some that I've worked for over my time, have not given enough attention to the issue I raised earlier on, in-work poverty, such that I think a lot of your polling respondents would probably think that when you say welfare claimants to them, they will think of someone who is not working, who is, there are words which are used by headline writers and not politicians, unfortunately, feckless, idle, work shy, all the rest of it. But that is a very deep-rooted perception, which partly comes from media coverage. It partly comes from an earlier generation of politicians. I think it was in this, well, I was certainly in this conference centre or others. I remember George Osborne, who'd like to talk about the hard-working Britain getting up in the morning and next door looking at the blinds being down. I think we all know what he meant by that. He meant that people on welfare weren't working, whereas of course lots of them are. So I think there has been a problem with the way we all collectively, media and politicians, talk about welfare. And that's why I'll pivot back to my original point about can we talk more about in-work welfare and working welfare. Because I think, to be a good panellist and actually answer the question you've asked me, that's why I think a lot of people think that welfare is not fair, because they think that people who have not worked, are not willing to work, are getting something. But I think if they are confronted with the reality that a lot of people are in fact working, at the same time as getting welfare, their attitudes are very likely to change.
If I could just jump in on that, I absolutely agree with James about the role of the media and the way these things are reported, and also particular generations of politicians as well. I do think issues such as long-term worklessness, habitual worklessness, workless households and benefit dependency were a real problem during the new Labour years, which was precisely the logic behind reforming the welfare system under David Cameron's government. And I think it is also true to say that a lot of that reform was actually, in some ways, rather successful, and perhaps some of those problems are not actually quite what they once were. When you talk about the question of fairness, I suppose the question of is it fair on recipients is slightly different from is it fair on the people who contribute into the system and perhaps feel as though they're not taking out. I suppose on the recipient side of things, I would say there is something that is profoundly fair about the system now that we have, which is that it's allocated on a household basis and it's done according to a rational means test. Obviously, it would be irrational to transfer benefits to somebody who's within a household which was actually on a household basis well off. So we've tackled that. It's a much better system thanks to universal credit. I suppose on the perception of unfairness on the recipient side, there's no getting away from the fact that universal credit was cut in terms of its generosity in real terms, year on year, from the period of austerity onwards, through things like the benefits freeze, appreciate they've been unfrozen now, and also the benefits cap being locked, so that came down in real terms every year, and also things like the two-child limit, which I think there are real questions about. Though I appreciate it is electorally popular, because of course people feel as though people should not be able to have a larger family than they can afford on the state's dime, as they would say in America. But nevertheless, is it right that we effectively punish children for being in a situation which is absolutely not of their making? Final thing I would say on fairness is that I do think we need to look again at those cliff edges. They are expensive to fix. You're talking approximately $1 billion per percentage point in order to bring down the taper rate from 63. Of course, 63p in the pound. Of course, some people who are also eligible to pay income tax and national insurance as well, particularly if they're working full-time, could be facing a real terms withdrawal rate of 75% as well, as came up in Prime Minister's questions a couple of weeks ago. And that is a real problem as well.
On that issue, all three of you have talked a lot about sort of the importance of making sure it does pay to work and tackling in-work poverty. Does it, considering that as has been sort of quite prominent in the news of late, that the taper rate does mean that for a lot of universal credit claimants, they will lose at least 63p of benefit for every extra pound that they earn. Does the system make work pay at the moment? And what should be the priorities when it comes to improving the reward for claimants who go out and do the right thing and get a job, or indeed have a job but increase their earnings, take a promotion, take on more hours?
Well, James referred to a randomised controlled trial that we did a few years ago, and people who's got the regular coaching from the work coach did increase. But I don't think what's as widely known is that something like 40% of people came off benefits entirely. So it prompted a kind of reaction in a slightly different way. Kind of having to go into the job centre fortnightly was enough of a trigger for people to massively step up or step away from deciding that they wanted that sort of interaction. So there's an element there that I do think that we will be progressing more of that. Candidly, the Prime Minister's been quite clear about this. We want to see better wages, but we can't just do that solely by regulation, although we've set ourselves the challenge of getting the national living wage to be 2/3 of median earnings by the end of this Parliament. But I think it's overall about how we end up having the prosperity. You've already discussed levelling up, but for me, that's what levelling up is about better prosperity for people. And one of the things that I'm convinced that we will continue to do more and more about will be the lifetime skills offer that we have. What is it that we're going to do? If you think back over a decade ago, after the financial element and with the Conservatives coming in with the coalition government, the choice was very clear and pretty much has stayed the same. We chose employment over productivity. Well, we can't continue to do that, and we don't want to continue to do that. And indeed, we want to see higher, better prosperity, better skills, better wages, and as the Prime Minister regularly says, not just having uncontrolled immigration, which often would help some of the lower wage element. So that's where we want to set our cloth very clearly, as it were, or head in that direction. And I think you'll see that coming through in a lot of what we're trying to do across government, as I say, via the levelling up agenda, it's not all just about infrastructure, it is about the investment in people. And we need to do that in partnership, in particular with our employers, so we can really have a prosperous society.
Any of you two want to come in on that issue, or are you happy to?
I can, well, we'll be polite and fine. I mean, well, the obvious answer is a more generous taper. I mean, a 63% loss of your marginal earnings is a significant disincentive. I mean, if we had a 63% rate of tax, actually we do, in fact, if you're on, I don't know if you may know, if you earn £121,000, I think you're effectively on a there's a funny little bracket between 100 and 120,000 pounds, but nobody cares about them, rightly so. But we generally accept that rate of withdrawal is a significant disincentive to more work. So but we should accept that 63% is a potential disincentive, but it is expensive. And there is no, if there is no magic money tree to conjure up the billions, then you have to look for other answers. And I won't repeat my point about employers. I will utterly endorse what Therese said about training. More training, please. That does involve better funding for further education and adult education provision. I think the lifelong loan entitlement being pushed by the Department for Education is potentially, if it is properly funded and advanced by the Treasury, hugely transformative of our long-term human productivity in this country, if it works. And I will only say two more things. Childcare and buses. Better childcare will allow more women to work and keep more, better, cheaper childcare will allow more women to work and keep more of their earnings. It's not just the responsibility of women to fund childcare, but that's often the way households do it. And better buses will allow people greater geographic mobility. A lot of the people in work welfare who are struggle to get up the wage ladder are struggling because they literally cannot physically relocate themselves to places where they can earn more or do so without facing prohibitive cost. I don't know what levelling up means, but I hope it means childcare and buses.
Thank you. I think we will open up the floor to some questions. If we could have hands up, I suspect we'll have a mixture of delegates and journalists. Gentleman here.
Delegates. There's no democracy.
Thank you. Can I ask the Secretary of State, following suggestions in the recent Green Paper, are you able to rule out definitively the possibility of merging means-tested universal credit with non-means-tested personal independence payment?
So I don't think we're looking at that. We're looking at measures on the white paper. Quite a lot of the green paper, and health is everyone's business, is a big focus not only on improving the processes of the system, but actually about how we keep people in work. So we lose about 300,000 people drop out of work. There's quite an interesting pilot which we're doing with the Midlands engine about mental health elements and productivity and how we keep people, as I say, in work. So but I think we're looking at more innovative just rather than trying to force fit different benefits together. But everything is on the table, I think is the best way of saying it, because the Green Paper is quite broad. We want to get some focus on genuine innovative thinking. Are these benefits actually working? That's the question I often ask my officials. Are they having the intended desire? And if not, what are we going to do about that? Or what has something come out better than we expected in that regard? I think like any green paper, we've covered a number of different issues. The white paper should be out next year. I'm just keen that it's not always about design. It's the broader outcome of how we get people, improving processes, but also how we encourage and reduce the disability employment gap that we have today to try and help people be more prosperous, not only in terms of money in their pocket, but also the mental well-being that often comes with being in work.
The lady right at the back. Left. Yeah.
I'm a Surrey County Councillor and a Borough Councillor in Epsom, and there's a 10-year life expectancy deficit in one of my wards compared to the rest. I've got two questions really that are linked. One is, do you think that the welfare system takes account of places like Surrey where almost everything is more expensive? And I don't think it does. Secondly, if we had greater funding for things like SEND and employability for those people who have issues, who desperately want to be in work, we wouldn't necessarily need to give them welfare. And we have a huge shortfall in Surrey for SEND funding.
So in terms of SEND, clearly there's an element of aspects that come through Department of Health, but also Department of Education, depending on the age range of that. I think there are some differentials. I expect the local housing allowance will be different in Surrey than it may be to parts of Suffolk, where I represent, reflecting more of that local market. But I think if you're the councillor for Epsom, as I pointed out to Chris Grayling recently, the local housing allowance may not always cover constituency by constituency, but a certain geography within that area. So in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, trying to get more upstream, and some of the support that we can do would probably be better use of taxpayers' money and actually be more better for people, just as we set out in the National Disability Strategy, a cross-government approach. We want to try and help improve people's lives on a daily basis. So there'll be different approaches on how we can try and make that become true as a lived experience for people with disability and long-term health conditions.
Gavin, yeah?
Could I just add on to that, I think I absolutely take the point about this regional disparities. Obviously, the cost of living is extremely different, and that's not fully reflected in the way that the welfare system works. The UK is actually one of the most fiscally centralised states in the industrialised world. Other developed economies tend to have different tax and benefit regimes on a much more kind of diffused basis. But to come back to James's point about the role of the media, I was sort of reflecting on this the other day, and I thought, well, should, for instance, the minimum wage be different in different parts of the country, reflecting the cost of living? Should benefits be different in different parts of the country to reflect the cost of living? But of course, it would then be reported by the press if you were to do that as, you know, welfare cuts for people living in a place that has a lower cost of living. So I think that'd be very, very difficult to achieve.
It was indeed reported that way in 2011-12, I think, when the coalition brief looked at it. I helped report it that way, I'm sorry.
No, not at all. Just the final point, on those who really do want to be in work but are struggling with various kind of complex obstacles that may be preventing them. We at the CSJ believe very strongly that yes, just increasing benefits may be able to help them just in terms of income, but actually many people need more sophisticated interventions than that. And we would support a kind of a local authority based wraparound system of support that we call universal support, in which basically a local key worker appointed by the local authority would be able to triage government-based with third sector-based systems of support for all sorts of problems that people are struggling with, whether it's educational stuff, whether it's addiction problems, whether it's money management, whether it's upskilling, or whether it's mental health, and basically create a bespoke wraparound package for each of those individuals in need of that support. And that could go much further, I think, than just saying, well, just increase benefits.
And we'll take two questions at a time now, I think. Dan, well, do you want to do, I can see Dan Bloom with his hand up.
Dan Bloom from the Daily Mirror. Secretary of State, you spoke there about encouraging people who perhaps think at the moment that they can't work into work. Could I ask, does this include the rising number of people on PIP that you talked about? And how do you plan to sort of construct that so that it doesn't, it doesn't risk pressurising or demonising people that genuinely can't work and making them feel like they have to?
And Nick Eardley over there.
A question for the Secretary of State as well. Given all the pressures on the cost of living, how worried are you about the impact of the end of the uplift this week? And there seems to be a lot of support up there for reducing the taper rate. Would you consider yourself supportive of that, Secretary of State? Do you think the Chancellor might have something to say on that in the spending review?
Well, the taper rate was originally designed, I think, by IDS to be at 55%, and it came in a lot higher than that and got reduced a couple of years ago. So clearly it's one of those trajectories that was part of the original model in that regard. Whether or not that is the top priority for using taxpayers' money right now, post-pandemic, clearly will be decided within government and announced if that is the case. But I think it's fair to say, and just speaking to Dan, I mean, the thing about PIP, plenty of people work who have PIP, and I think this is one of the things that we still have two benefit systems where the old legacy, as we call them, would be more about your condition, whereas PIP is about, you may have a clinical or medical condition which a disability or impairment of some kind. But so it's about how can you operate without that? So how can you live independently? And that's what PIP goes into. So people are more likely, as likely, dare I say it, to have PIP while working than not necessarily while they are. And that's where you get another benefit called the Employment Support Allowance. So in terms of ESA, which is the acronym for that, I think one of the things that I am keen to do is to see what we can do more, as say, about what people can do rather than the benefit system being driven currently by what you cannot do. So that's the approach I'm trying to turn around. We have got a new Minister for Welfare Delivery in David Rutley, but also for disabled people and work and health. And that's the whole theme and push of not trying to demonise people who can't work. I know your paper and BBC will have many images of people where wrong decisions have been made quite clearly, but generally I think it is about trying to help people in that direction without having the demonisation you suggest, Dan.
I think to add to that, I think, is it fair to say that one of the particular issues is that with ESA, which is obviously also now being integrated into the Universal Credit System, the support group at the moment is a lot larger than had been expected.
Yeah.
And there's not, the system doesn't sort of allow for a lot of support for those people who may want to work or want to start moving back towards work.
Yeah, I think the original intention, James, was it was going to be about 20-25% of people in what's called the support group, where realistically people would not be expected to look for work for a variety of reasons, and that's more like 80%. So there's something there about estimates previously, and that's why, but even now, as I say, people try to accumulate all sorts of different points as the process in order to reach a certain level of support, and I want to see what we can do more to help with that.
Yeah. We'll take the lady there with her hand up in the middle. Is the mic working?
Hello.
There we go.
So I have two questions. The first one being, do you think it's appropriate maybe to kind of split people into taxpayers and not taxpayers when we talk about benefits, considering that a lot of people have paid money in their entire lives, so this is kind of a return. And also people pay VAT whether or not they're in work or not when it comes to getting by day to day. Actually, I might have three. So another one is are there any plans to cut PIP? I know you've mentioned it there. And then my final one is, do you, when it comes to low-income households, we know that if kids can't eat enough, for example, on a day-to-day, it affects their ability to study, it affects their ability to concentrate, which will have a knock-on impact on their education and then obviously their job prospects. Do you think it's almost a vicious circle in that if you're not providing enough welfare, particularly to children, you're kind of creating a cycle of people claiming benefits?
And if we could also get this so we get as many people as possible, this gentleman at the front.
Secretary of State, do you think there's scope to do more in terms of using data science to address some of these questions? Because now you've got millions of people, you've got a very good and robust database. And I mean, if this were about getting them to click on Facebook ads, there'd be a lot of very, very smart people working hard to achieve that rather trivial goal. Can we harness some of the brilliant people in data science to help you achieve these really vital goals of improving people's lives?
I'm sure anybody else can chip in if they wish to.
Yes.
But no, I'm happy to answer them. It's not of trying to avoid it. So, yeah, it's a fair point. Indirect tax through VAT and similar absolutely is an element of how tax is raised for spending. I'm conscious that people will end up paying taxes in a variety of ways while still getting support as in-work benefits. And I'm conscious that we want to do more to try and help people, improve their prospects so they don't need the support of universal credit anymore. But that's still, as is pointed out, I think it's just something like over £100 billion does go towards, or just under £100 billion goes to people in working age in terms of benefit support. I'm not aware of any plans to cut PIP. We went into the manifesto with a commitment ending the freeze of benefits. We've delivered that. In terms of low-income households and food, so one of the things that I'm also keen in working with our child maintenance service is to think about how recognising some of the statistics that were said earlier, when you have two parents working, I think it's 35 hours each, then the chances of being in poverty are very, very small. And so what is it that we can do to improve things like aspects of childcare? But where there are single parents, I'm quite keen to see what we can do, conscious of some of the issues that will arise, but about how we maximise the income from the other parent to go towards the support of the child. So there's a number of ways about how we can try and help boost their income through work, but also about potentially financial arrangements. But tackling the cost of living is also a big challenge. And it was said earlier, whether it's childcare, whether it's transport, that's why there's at the moment an interministerial group working on these issues about what we can do to try and improve that as well.
Gavin, do you want to just come in quickly? I know you need to head off.
Yes, just very quickly. On the issue of welfare adequacy or welfare generosity or whatever you want to call it, there's lots of debates that you can have about what the level of welfare, should be. You can do a relative poverty test, you can do a basket of goods test, and so on. You can ask people whether the level is enough to live on. There is a kind of a reality around this, which is the constraints on public spending. The issue is if you put up the generosity of welfare because of the number of recipients of universal credit and indeed of legacy benefits, that always implies a significant spending. So, for example, the Treasury calculated that to retain the £20 uplift permanently would cost £6 billion per year. But of course, the issue there is the number of people receiving universal credit. The OBR, Office of Budget Responsibility, calculated that the vast majority of those increased costs didn't come from the uplift in generosity. They came from the increase in the number of people in the system. So we would be able to afford, in many ways, a more generous welfare system on a per-head basis if we could get into a situation where there were fewer people who actually were in need of universal credit. And we could get to that through economic growth, through higher wages. I think we also need to be talking more about unstable families as well. But I absolutely agree we could get to that situation if we could get those pressures of numbers down.
Can I just come briefly on the data point? And just raise a slight note of caution, I suppose. There is a tendency now to say we can do everything with data. We can do everything online. And we just did a sort of an evidence review of sort of personalised support around welfare and employment. And there is no substitute for direct one-to-one contact between human beings here. I know it's not the point you're making, but I think we just need to remember that the best help you can provide for people on welfare to climb the ladder, progress, is to have them probably literally in the same room as another human being who talks to them and helps them. Maybe they can help identify those people, target the help bit better, but we mustn't think that we can deliver that support electronically.
I think we've probably got time for one last round of questions. We get Mike down here.
Hi, Tony Diver from the Daily Telegraph. Another one for the Secretary of State, if she doesn't mind. Just on a broader question about taxation, Jacob Rees-Mogg this afternoon has said that he believes that the tax burden in this country has reached the highest level that it could reasonably be, and that any further increase would lead to a lower total tax take. Do you agree with him?
Well, when Jacob and I both came in 2010, we voted for tax rises, we voted for tax cuts. We've had to do the measures that we felt were necessary at the time. I think, as the Prime Minister's alluded to, it's done with great reluctance, but there's an element here about how the PM has set out. This is not just about being a tax-raising government, far from it, but we have just been through a pandemic, we have just done unprecedented support, and we have to take an appropriate way to balance the finances, recognising the other challenges that are coming our way, including the potential of inflation and what that could do in different ways. I mean, just briefly building on data science, I have got a lot of data scientists and analysts, and one of our challenges, I would say, at DWP, we are very good at the macro level element, and one of the things that I've made a change to doing, or improved is something we call the Family Resources Survey. And at the moment, that's been done on a survey sample of 20,000 people, and decisions costing billions of pounds are based on that size of sample, which is pretty big, but I've arranged for that to be increased to about 45 to 50,000 people in the sample survey, so we can go a bit more deeper into understanding different households in different parts of the country, because I want to make sure that while we have a national framework, a lot of what we do is about local delivery and the differences we can make in individual towns, as well as that broader sense of national policy direction.
And just to bring James in a bit on that, obviously the fiscal situation at the moment is, as the Secretary of State alluded to, very tight. For you, what do you think the priority would be if you were Therese, and through some miracle the Chancellor came to you and said, "You've got £1 billion, do what you want with it"? Where would you put it?
Most of it on reducing the taper and a little bit of it on increasing coaching via Jobs Centre Plus. I think. To pick up on, I just thought two recent questions actually. Teresa mentioned the family resource survey. To actually go back to an earlier question about child hunger, I think it is very much to the department's credit that the family resource survey will, as of next year, I think it is, start giving us data reporting on child hunger, which frankly...
We introduced it this year, food insecurity.
Yes, it's food insecurity, but are we actually seeing the results yet? Or yes, so well done you for essentially creating a stick with which you can be beaten. I think that's a good contribution to better debate around this policy. I'm not going to get into talking to my former colleagues at the Daily Telegraph about the Laffer curve, but we'll go to the bar afterwards and talk about it. But the leader that's already been written on the subject, commending Jacob for his economic accuracy, is not one I would agree with. But
I think we probably have time to squeeze in one last question if there's one more.
There's a lady right at the back as well who's had her hand up for a while.
Yeah, we will go for the lady at the back. I couldn't see. Thank you.
It's okay.
Thank you. Katie Schmucker from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I just wanted to re-ask a bit of Nick Erdley's question, which got a little bit lost in the responses. He asked, how worried are you about the forthcoming cut to universal credit and working tax credits, given the rising cost of living pressures? Because, let's face it, no one's bills are about to go down by £20 per week in the coming months.
Well, I can give the same answer we give all the time, Katie. It was a temporary uplift. There was a recognition, I think a decision was taken quite early on. People brand new into the benefits element, it was set at a similar level, that uplift, as what you would get for statutory sick pay, where again, people could not work through no fault of their own. It's always been designed to be temporary, and I'm very pleased that we were able to announce the 500 million household support fund, which will run from, well, it's already running until the end of March, particularly conscious of some of the spikes that it feels are about to happen, particularly on energy bills, but I'm conscious that there's other ways that people might be looking for support. It builds on the fact that welfare spending did increase by over 7 billion. We have run some local support grants right throughout this time as well to give some targeted funding, and I'm conscious that that's something that we will try and make sure reaches the people who are really struggling, and I don't want anybody to be under the illusion that we know that these are challenging times, but alongside that, it's about the continuing to invest in people to get back into work and to get on in work is really the direction of travel that's been clearly set out as what it is that we want to try and do to help people become more prosperous.
Thank you. I think that's probably all we've got time for, and it only remains for me to say thank you hugely to the Secretary of State and to James Kirkhope, and in his absence to Gavin as well. If you do want to pick up a copy of our report at the back of the room, please do. There should be plenty. And please do follow us on Twitter, and please do come to all of the rest of our events, and have a great conference, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.